Our little friendly breeze now visited us again and lasted about as long as before, thrusting us possibly 100 yards farther from the breakers. We were still, however, in the very jaws of destruction. A small opening had been seen in the reef about a furlong from us. Its breadth was scarce the length of the ship. Into this, however, it was resolved to push her if possible. Within was no surf, therefore we might save our lives. The doubt was only whether we could get the ship so far. A little breeze, however, a third time visited us and pushed us almost there. The fear of death is bitter. The prospect we now had before us of saving our lives there at the expense of everything we had made my heart set much lighter on its throne, and I suppose there were none but what felt the same sensations. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the history of fresh produce. And that, Patrick, was a passage from the diary and journal of Joseph Banks in a scene that sounds somewhat distressing. And we're going to be actually talking about that in the first half of today's episode. And just to catch people up of where we've been, because this is now part 3 of our multi-part series on the life of Joseph Banks. In the last episode, we left the Endeavour edging its way up this eastern coast of what Cook called New Holland, what we now call Eastern Australia, or the eastern side of Australia. And Joseph Banks is exhilarated by the botanical riches of Botany Bay, which we heard about. The crew was buoyed by the sense that the worst of the voyage might be behind them. But of course, and this is somewhat of a spoiler alert, it was not, because things are just getting started in terms of the worst of what this voyage is going to throw at them. Because today's episode starts with absolute terror about noise in the night, splintering wood, water pouring into a wooden hull, and the sudden awful realization that the ship carrying you, your discoveries, and your hopes of getting home may not survive until morning. So we're going to pick up this story with the Endeavour in the Great Barrier Reef, a scene of near total disaster that nearly ended up not just ending Cook's voyage, but Banks's botanical legacy before it really even began.
And this is one of those moments where history really does balance on the edge of a coral blade.
Yeah, quite literally. And as we'll see for Banks, this isn't just a naval drama. It's a moment where plants, pressed leaves, seeds, specimens suddenly matter just as much as pumps, anchors, and tides. So let's see what happens here. So it's early on the morning of 11th of June, 1770, and Cook weighs anchor and sails north. And the Endeavour is threading its way through a nightmare geography. So you got reefs, shoals, half-seen coral heads just beneath the surface. And at sunset, rocks and shallows are spotted ahead, the Picker's Gill Reef looming in the fading light. But by the time Banks sits down to supper, the water beneath the ship deepens again, and it seems at this point safe enough. Nothing to really be worried about. So Banks, reassured, goes to bed, and as he put it, in quote, perfect security. But Patrick, in a scene very reminiscent of the Titanic, at around 11 o'clock at night, the ship stops. Okay, not slowed, not nudged, but an abrupt, shuddering halt.
This is the moment every sailor fears, right? That sudden, unnatural stillness.
Yeah, it's like that scene in Titanic where you just all the engines go quiet and you're not moving, and
right?
Like, what's
and you're
happening?
like,
This doesn't seem good.
this is not where we wanted this to go tonight.
No. So this is exactly what the people on the Endeavour are facing, but a little different reaction than on the Titanic. So the men on deck are hurled forward.
Right.
Those asleep in their bunks are flung about like dice in the back. So, okay, so maybe that part's like the Titanic. So the Endeavour has basically smashed into what Banks would later describe as the tropical equivalent of an iceberg, and that is sunken coral.
Okay.
And Banks writes in his journal, scarce were we warm in our beds while we were called up with the alarming news of the ship being fast ashore upon a rock. And not just any rock, Patrick, because these were coral reefs, and what Banks called the most dreadful of all others, because of their sharp points and grinding quality, capable of cutting through a ship's bottom almost immediately. So the ship wasn't just stuck. It was essentially being eaten alive.
Well, yeah, and coral doesn't give. It's like being wedged onto broken glass.
Yeah, it's not what you want to be stuck on. But Cook springs into action. This is not a guy that gets easily panicked. So in this clear moonlight of the evening, orders are just flying left and right. All sails are hauled in to stop the ship being driven further onto the reef, of course. That's the last thing they want, is to wedge even further into it. Boats are lowered, depths are sounded. Barefoot sailors are scrambling 25 meters up the rigging to bring down canvas, clinging on as the ship rocks violently beneath them against the rocks. And there's Banks just watching it all with a mixture of terror and admiration, broken planks floating past and the deck pitched underfoot. And yet, Banks notes that the officers behave with inimitable coolness, void of all hurry and confusion. And which is just amazing. I mean, it just shows you these guys are calm, they're doing what they got to do. But time here is the enemy, because the tide is almost at its highest point at this point. And if the ship can't be freed before it falls again, the Endeavour might simply just be smashed to pieces. So Cook tries warping her off the reef, sending a boat ahead with an anchor and attempting to drag the ship forward, but nothing happens. This sturdy old coal ship just refuses to move, and so they begin throwing the ship away. Not the actual ship, but everything they can within the ship. So an iron ballast, 10 tons of it, goes overboard. Then you get the guns being tossed over. 6 heavy carriage guns disappear into the sea, along with precious fresh water supplies, firewood, oil jars, hoop staves, decayed stores, anything that could lighten the ship. And eventually Banks does step in. He rolls up his sleeve. He's hauling and heaving alongside the sailors. But inside, he's already preparing himself for death. he's kind of tracking all the different scenarios that could come out of this. And he fears the hull will not hold. He hopes only that the pumps could keep up with the water pouring in. Now, night passes, daybreak arrives, and he realizes they're perhaps 40 kilometers offshore, far enough to drown, but close enough to imagine the horrors of reaching land unarmed, starving, and just surrounded by unknown peoples. There is no good scenario here. And yet, again, he is just struck by something remarkable. He writes, quote, "All this time, the seamen worked with surprising cheerfulness and alacrity. No grumbling or growling was to be heard, not even an oath." And this, again, from a ship usually well stocked with people grumbling and discontent and complaints.
Yeah, whew, I mean, listen, there's a lot going on, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's something almost like eerie about this whole situation, John. Am I right? Like, kind of calm at the edge of like extinction almost.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to think a lot of these sailors probably knew there was a chance.
They knew they weren't going to end up on the greener side of the
no, but they're all keeping cool heads, which I don't know. If
I wouldn't be.
Scenario. Yeah,
I'd be like, why is my tent wet? What's going on here? Why are the food rations depleting?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I would be that calm. That's for sure. But with all the calmness, that's not stopping the water from entering the ship. So by the next high tide, the ship still isn't budging. The pumps are going constantly. Then they add a third pump in there. Cook wants a fourth, but there are just simply not enough hands to manage it. So by 9 in the evening on the 12th of June, the ship shifts slightly. But that ends up being a terrible thing, because the leak that had been going into the hull now becomes a flood.
Okay.
And Cook is just stunned. And then Banks, by his own admission, entirely gives up hope at this point. He's calling it. He's saying, all right, this is curtains closed, right? So this is the most critical moment now. Banks begins packing what he thinks he might save: papers, specimens, journals. He knows the boat can't carry everyone, right? He's already angling like the people on Titanic. There's only so many boats out there. He's trying to figure out, okay, well, how can I get a boat, and how can I put as much of my stuff in a boat? Forget everybody else on board.
Of course.
Because again, he knows some are going to drown, others might survive ashore only to starve or be killed.
Wow.
And so he's rushing around doing whatever Banks is doing. And then 10 o'clock that night, 23 hours after striking the reef, Cook makes a final desperate decision, a Hail Mary. Every hand not on the pump goes to the capstan and windlass. Banks joins them. Ropes are hauled taut. Muscles are being strained. Faces contorted. Of course, prayers are probably being murmured in between all of this. And Bank writes, quote, "The dreadful time now approached. Fear of death now stared us in the face." And then, Patrick, at 20 minutes past 10, after 20 minutes of this panic and just throwing every last inch that they could into solving this, the Endeavour moves. And not only does she move, but she floats. And so you have cheers and cries. The men holler into the deeper water. And they're, mind you, there's still nearly 4 feet of water in the hold. But again, they are alive and they are freed from this coral reef. So Banks breathes again. The ship is saved just. And Cook orders a desperate repair because again, they're not quite out of it yet. I mean, they've made a big step, but they're not quite out. So the hull is fothered, which is basically patched from the outside with an old sail smeared with okram wool and sheep dung. And as Banks memorably puts it, there was now, quote, "nothing but a lock of wool between us and destruction." And so, guided by small boats, this crippled ship creeps through the razor maze of coral for 65 kilometers. Remember, they're still in the midst of the Great Barrier Reef. They're just, it's literally a minefield. And so until the 14th of June, they reached the mouth of a shimmering river, Wallumbal Biri, which would soon to be called the Endeavour River. And here at last, there was shelter. And here, while the carpenters would labor for 7 long weeks to repair a hole large enough to sink a ship twice over, Banks and Solander will quietly carry out the most productive botanical work of the entire voyage. Nearly 1,000 species described, hundreds new to science.
So from almost total annihilation comes extraordinary abundance, right?
Yeah, it's one of those double-edged swords, right? Now, what Cook did not know, what he could possibly not have known, was that the place he chose to save his ship was about as safe as anywhere on that coast could be. So the river they leant into, Patrick, the one that would become known as the Endeavour River, was regarded by the local Aboriginal peoples as neutral ground. So what does that mean? This was basically an area that was not a battlefield, not a contested stretch of land, but a place set aside for settlement rather than conflict. And so it was to this place actually that rival clans came to resolve disputes, to conduct ceremonies and initiations, and even for women to give birth. It was really in every sense a place of pause, and that mattered immensely.
Yeah, and it's always going to, right, in certain situations, right? And
Yeah.
it's one of those moments too, right, where Cook's luck extends well beyond seamanship, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Literally.
geez. Yeah, I mean, the amount of luck in finding such an island. I mean, what are the chances of that? And Banks records that the Endeavour was sailed some 800 meters into the river mouth and moored alongside of a steep beach on the south side. And here at last, they can breathe. They're not relaxing, but they can breathe. And so on the 22nd of June, the ship is deliberately grounded on the sand so the damage can be inspected. Because again, they have an idea of what happened, but they don't have full eyes on it. But Patrick, once they really pull it back and see what happened, what they see is horrifying. Banks is stunned because in the middle of the oak hull is a hole, in his words, large enough to have sunk a ship with twice our pumps. So the coral rock had ended up actually cutting clean through the planking and deep into one of the timbers beneath, smoothing the wood so neatly that it looked as if it had been hacked with an axe.
Ooh.
And then came the realization, the kind that really sends a shiver up the spine, even after the danger has passed, that the chunk of coral that tore the hole had stayed lodged in place. So basically, the coral that caused this whole thing had actually acted like a plug. And without it, the Endeavour would have flooded and sunk in minutes. And
Really?
and Banks understood immediately that that accidental wedge of coral had probably saved every single life on board.
Mm. And this extraordinary destruction and salvation coming from the same object.
Yeah, exactly. Nature as executioner and rescuer all at once.
Right?
Uh, but yeah, so now while the ship's carpenters are set to work, again, a process that would take them about 7 weeks, Banks makes another discovery. And this one for him is almost as painful because when the ship had been hauled ashore, water inside the hull flowed backward, flooding the bread room. And that, unfortunately, had been the very place where Banks had stored his precious botanical collections. Plants gathered across the Atlantic. Remember, we've been to many places by this point. South America, the Pacific, all of
Mhm.
it, all
Mhm.
these collections he had made had been soaking in this dirty Blige water. And Banks writes, quote, "Many were saved, but some entirely lost and spoiled." And for Banks, I mean, this was just a complete catastrophe. I mean, these weren't, curiosities, which some people might have considered them to be, but these were scientific treasures, irreplaceable records of the natural world. And so almost immediately, he and Solander begin to do it all over again, right? Presses are reopened, papers dried, the crew helps collect. What had been lost would now just have to be replaced here on this unfamiliar shore. And at first glance, Banks was unimpressed with what he was seeing in this new location. He thought the surrounding landscape had been, quote, doomed to everlasting barrenness. But as so often happened on this voyage, closer attention revealed otherwise. So there was wild kale, resembling the West Indian cocos.
Okay.
The roots of this plant were too acrid to eat, but the leaves, when boiled, were, quote, little inferior to spinach. There were cabbage palms, which Banks dismissed as, quote, very bad, uh, beans of limited promise, and wild plantain trees bearing banana like fruit so full of stones that it was scarcely edible. There was also a local taro, and there were these strange fruits that would later be called Bertaken plums, which were
Oh,
hard and unpleasant when picked, but after a few days softening into something resembling what Banks described as, quote, indifferent damsons.
this guy, I swear. Like,
Good old
I
Banks.
mean, say what you will about Banks, but he's never shy about letting you know when something disappoints him.
No, and look, I'm sure he's,
No
he's
way.
he's probably still got a chip on his shoulder after losing everything from this accident. So he's probably not in the best of moods when he's
Yeah.
seeing all these. He's probably like cursing every new plant he sees. You're not as good as the other one.
Not as good as my ex.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, look, Banks is just endlessly judgmental. That's his
Yeah.
personality. But he's also endlessly curious. And despite his endless complaints, this day became the most productive botanical period of the entire Australian voyage. And by Sunday, the 1st of July, repairs are complete enough for Cook to start thinking about leaving. And so Banks joins him and the officers on this high point overlooking the river to scout a way out to sea. But unfortunately, the bad news keeps coming because what they see is grim. And Banks writes, the prospect was indeed melancholy. So the sea was filled everywhere with shoals, some visible, some lurking just beneath the surface, and there was just no obvious straight passage out.
There was nothing.
No, it's like everywhere they turn, it's just closed door, closed door, closed door.
Yeah.
But still, time is running out. Right, the Endeavour had spent 7 weeks on the river. 7 weeks, by far Banks'
Yeah.
longest stay in New Holland. And in that time, he and Solander had collected 348 species, 310 of them new to science. Among them were hoop pine, sea hibiscus, cedar, kangaroo grass, tulip wood, plants that would eventually shape European understanding of Australia's ecology and agricultural potential.
Yeah.
But that's all great. I'm sure Banks loved that, but discovery doesn't fill bellies, right? So again, 7 weeks they're here. So provisions are running dangerously low, and ahead lay a long passage, or as Banks wrote,
Very long
a
passage.
long passage to make to the East Indies through an unknown and perhaps dangerous sea. So on the morning of the 4th of August at 5 o'clock, the Endeavour creeps back into motion slowly, of course, because again, there's these coral and shoals everywhere. They're moving cautiously. Cook steers as if guiding a wounded animal through a minefield, trying to keep her from being dashed to pieces on the coral. And for 3 days, they lay at anchor, pinned down by a gale. And then by the 10th of August, they're about 70 kilometers north of the Endeavour River. And Cook and Banks climb a peak, which Cook names Point Lookout, which, not very creative, but probably that's the last thing on their mind is creative namings. And they look out, and with sinking hearts, they see that the hazards are far from over. They just are not catching a break. So the next day, Banks joins Cook in the pinnace, rowing out to a cluster of islands to the northeast. And from the highest hill, Cook sees, to his mortification, another 18 kilometers of reef stretching across their path. And so in the hazy distance, the sea appears to be breaking violently, and Cook suspects at this point that these must be the outmost shoals of the reef. There are, however, gaps, and gaps, of course, means hope. And so on the 13th of August, the Endeavour passes through an opening in the reef 800 meters wide. That's about 2,600 feet for those our American listeners. And suddenly beneath them, there's 100 fathoms of water. Fathom is another unit, in which, again, for the sake of our listeners, which is about 600 feet of water. And so for the first time in 3 months, no land is visible.
Oh,
And Banks is ecstatic. He goes on to write, quote, "That very ocean which had formerly been looked upon with terror by all of us was now the asylum we had long wished for." And satisfaction, he noted, was written on just every face aboard the Endeavour. But
wow.
Patrick, the sea, again, was not finished with them, because before sunrise on the 16th of August,
Of
Banks
course.
hears it. Okay, he hears it, the roar of surf. And as daylight creeps in, fast foaming billows are appearing less than a mile away, and the ship is being carried toward them with terrifying speed. And for those that might not be following the nautical description I'm painting here, if you see foaming billows in the distance in the middle of the ocean,
Like run.
there's something there, right? That they're not just foaming for nothing. That's rocks or coral or something. So by 6 o'clock, the Endeavour is within 200 meters of the breakers, 40 yards from the reef. Between them and annihilation lie only a, quote, dismal valley, the breadth of one wave. And Blanks was blunt, writing that a speedy death was all they had to hope for at this point. And so the boats would be smashed. Land was impossibly distant. Escape was just unthinkable. There were no options if they were going to hit these breakers. And then at the very moment when hope seemed absurd, Patrick, a breath of wind, a literal
Here it
breath
comes.
of wind, a tiny breeze, one they would never have noticed on any other day. And Banks called it, quote, our little friendly breeze. And that was the quote I read at the top of this episode. And every scrap of sail was set to catch it. They were throwing everything to catch that wind. And slowly, agonizingly, it checked the ship's deadly slide toward the reef, pushing her perhaps 100 yards farther from destruction. Still perilously close, but at this point, they are alive. And then the lookout shouts, there is an opening, barely 200 meters wide. I mean, that is tiny, but it's something. And the ebb tide surges through it like a millstream. And as the water pours out, it seizes the Endeavour and carries her away from the reef a quarter of a mile into safety. And Cooks ends up naming it Providential Channel. And Richard Pickersgill, the master's mate, writes, quote, this is the narrowest escape we ever had. Without what he called the, quote, immediate help of Providence, not a single life would have been saved.
Wow. And you can hear the relief dripping off the page. Seriously.
Yeah. I mean, you really can. And with that escape, the Endeavour finally turns her bow toward the East Indies, toward Indonesia, and an entirely new chapter in this voyage. Because surviving the reef was only the beginning, Patrick. And you know what? I mean, how nobody has made a movie about this adventure is beyond me. I mean, these scenes. I mean, I could just see this already in a movie, right? I mean,
Oh my God.
this
Uh,
is
uh,
everything.
it's, I can tell you you're you're unfortunately right, John, right? Like, think about that. So by the end of August 1770, like what happened, right? Like
Yeah, what's
it
next?
that's what I'm saying. Like, um, the Endeavor finally limps clear of what could would later call the insane labyrinth, the Great Barrier Reef, right? After weeks of terror, grinding coral, emergency repairs, and the constant fear that the ship might simply disintegrate beneath them, right? There is at least, right? And at last, open water ahead. And with it, a destination that promises salvation. Batavia. Today, it's Jakarta. In 1770, it was the beating heart of the Dutch East Indies, that nerve center of one of the most powerful commercial empires on earth. If you want spices, ships, skilled shipwrights, warehouses stacked with food and cloth and rope, this is where you would go, John.
Oh yeah, Jakarta's. That is definitely the place to get pretty much everything you need if you're in that region of the world. And there's obviously a lot of trade going there. And psychologically speaking, I mean, this must have felt like stepping back into Europe after what, like nearly 2 years away.
Oh my gosh, exactly. And almost 2 years since Rio, right?
Yeah.
So nearly 2 years of island, right? Of just straight islands, unfamiliar languages, improvised diplomacy, right? Like think about it. Like um constant danger all the time. And suddenly, right, everyone, suddenly canals, brick buildings, windmills, Dutch flags snapping into the breeze. It must have felt really surreal, right?
Yeah.
So the Endeavor reaches Batavia on the 9th of October, 1770, everyone. The harbor is crowded with European ships coming and going. East India men bound for India, China, and Ceylon. This is a global crossroads, right? And Cook knows immediately what it offers him. Skilled dockyards to repair a battered ship, a chance to send his first official dispatches home, right? And perhaps most precious of all, letters. For the first time since South America, the men can write home with some confidence that their words might actually arrive. And it's from Batavia that London newspapers first learn the astonishing news that Cook, Banks, and the Endeavor are alive. But Batavia has a reputation.
Yeah. And I'd say a bad one at that.
Don't talk like that about Batavia. A lethal one is what I'll say. Europeans call it the cemetery of Europeans, and they're not exaggerating. The Dutch have ruled here for more than a century and a half, right? But it has come at a terrifying cost. The city is ringed by marshland, its canals so proudly modeled on Amsterdam. And, right, they're stagnant, foul, and alive with mosquitoes, malaria, dysentery, fevers, and even a description of it flourishes here, right? So, still, the Endeavor's men are confident, almost cocky even. They've survived storms, reefs, starvation, and scurvy. They arrive looking, as Banks puts it, remarkably fresh and healthy. They tell themselves they're seasoned now, hardened. They are among, right? Or and guess what? All wrong. They're among wrong men, right? And
Yeah.
before we continue here, John, let's take a step back for a moment because before Batavia proper, there's a brief but telling interlude. By mid September, Banks notes something extraordinary in his journal. For the first time in nearly 2 years, he sees people in European dress. The locals, he observes, resemble the Malayas in color and dress. There is the outer edge of European empire, familiar, but not quite. Yet tensions are high. Britain and the Netherlands are rivals. Trade wars loom. The Dutch authorities, led by John Christoph Lang, a German governor working for the VOC, are suspicious. Banks and Solander want to roam the countryside, botanicizing, and as they always do, right? But the answer this time was no.
Yeah. That's again that no, which must have completely driven Banks mad again. Like,
Oh, 100%.
like in
Oh my
Rio.
gosh. I mean, just think about that. It completely. And but Solander, ever the diplomat, steps in. He reassures that the Dutch that this is science, not espionage. Eventually, Lang and the local Regia, the local leader, come aboard the Endeavor themselves. And this is where Banks, the naturalist, becomes Banks the negotiator. Okay. Cook needs supplies, fresh food, vegetables, something, anything to stave off the disease, right? Well, Banks explains that several men are already unwell and make a very specific request of fresh greens, palm wine, which he believes is the anti-scorbutic virtues, right? And so over dinner, the conversation drifts, and so often does with Banks, to animals and agriculture. He describes Mouton to the Rajah. Cook then produces, right, the ship's last surviving sheep and offers it as a gift, John.
Well, that's a bold move.
Think about it. It is, and it works. When the Raja asks for an English dog, Banks doesn't hesitate. He gives up his own greyhound, laying hints that he'd quite like a spyglass, right? That's kind of how he was. One is immediately produced, right? Banks understands leverage. He understands that fresh produce in this moment is more valuable than almost anything he owns. So after 4 days of carefully managed hospitality, the Endeavour sails on passing Savu, a place Banks describes as immensely important to the Dutch and scarcely known to other Europeans. He writes it up in meticulous detail, not just for himself, but clearly for the, I would say, admiralty, for posterity, for the future British Empire. Then it's onward, Java Head and the Sunda Strait. Off Bantam on the 2nd of October, they encounter 2 Dutch East Indiamen. And here, in the middle of the Indian Ocean world, Banks gets a sudden jolt of home news. That's right. John Wilkes, Sandwich's old rival, has been elected as a MP, only to be thrown out. The American colonies are refusing to pay taxes. British troops are being shipped across the Atlantic. Russians are causing trouble in Poland. The world has been moving on without them.
Yeah, it's that strange moment where history snaps back into focus, right?
Right, exactly. For all their isolation, they are still part of a global story, okay? And as they approach Batavia itself, they believe reasonably that there's nearly home. The ship has survived. The men are remarkably free of scurvy. The voyage against all odds has worked. And then they arrived in the city of doom. Batavia is vast, more than 100,000 people, and nearly half of them are enslaved, brought by neighboring islands in India. The canals stink. The heat is oppressive. Disease hangs in the air. The Endeavour, meanwhile, is in desperate shape. The coral damage is far worse than they realize. In some places, just an eighth of an inch of oak separates the sea from the hold. Worms have eaten through the hull. Sails are shredded. Rigging is rotten. Dutch shipwrights set to work immediately. And meanwhile, Banks steps ashore and is universally warned of how unhealthy the place is. He shrugs it off. They all do. Their confidence borders on arrogance. By the end of the month, however, reality asserts itself. Tapea, already weakened, falls ill first. Then Tatia, his youngest companion, Banks, own servant, collapsed with fever. Banks himself is struck by intermittent fevers. Solander develops a constant grinding illness. Soon, everyone ashore and on board is sick. Banks is brutally honest about the cause: the low-lying land, the filthy canals, the stagnant water everywhere. And his rented house. Banks is seized by a tertian fever, malaria, flaring every second of the day. The fits are so violent that he loses consciousness, so weakening that he can barely crawl downstairs. His servants are just as bad. And Solander, who apparently has never been ill in his life, resists at first, but then he even succumbs. And then the death begins. The ship's surgeon, William Monkhouse, is confined to bed and dies on the 5th of November of 1770. His mate follows. Tatia dies on November 9th, devastating Tapea, who loved the boy deeply. Soon after, Tapea himself dies.
Yeah, it's extraordinary how quickly this just all begins to unravel.
Well, yeah, and how close Banks himself comes to dying. Solander becomes violently ill on November 12th. A local doctor tells Banks he's unlikely to survive at the nights. Banks, barely able to stand, sits with his friend until dawn, when miraculously Solander improves. On medical advice, Banks moves Solander and Sporing out of town to a ramshackle country house, hoping distance from the canals might save them. Banks treats himself with his, I would say, precious bark, guinea, and then slowly recovers. And then there's the remarkable thing: once his strength returns, Banks does what Banks always does. He writes 15,000 words, some account of Batavia, a sweeping survey of the city, its history, fortifications, churches, warships, spices, spirits, religion, and of course, its produce. His catalogs 36 types of fruit, which is pineapples, oranges, pomelos, lemons, limes, mangoes. And yet, tellingly, he's disappointed. After everything he's seen across the Pacific, Batavia's produce quality just doesn't seem to measure up.
Yeah, which is pretty extraordinary. You would expect that the fruit in that kind of region would be impressive to him.
I mean, it is, but it shows how Banks' standards. It's his botanical imagination, right? And that's why it's expanded over the years.
Yeah.
So he's thinking globally now, comparing ecosystems, weighing agricultural potential. And let's not forget, Batavia nearly kills him, but it also cements his understanding of how plants, empire, health, and power intersect. And it's here, right? Battered, grieving, but still astonishingly productive, that the Endeavour, right, finally turns her bow toward home. But the journey back to England will have its own dangers, right? Its own losses and its own consequences. So after the break, everyone, we're going to follow Cook, Banks, and the surviving crew as they leave the tropics behind and attempt to bring the Endeavour and everything she represents safely back to Britain. We'll be right back.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the history of fresh produce. So, Patrick, by this point in the voyage, you might think the great drama was over, right? We've had the reefs, but sailors have survived that. The maps drawn, the specimens gathered, the Pacific crossed. The adventure surely was winding down, but in many ways, the return journey was really the most harrowing chapter of all.
I mean, it truly was, man. This is all going downhill, right? And like any good movie, the real action comes at the very end, just when you think everything has been overcome, right?
Yeah, exactly. See, that's why this would make a great movie, because yeah, I mean, as far as the Endeavour case, when it turns west and then south again, heading across the Indian Ocean toward the Cape of Good Hope, the romance of discovery curdles into something just much darker. So the ship becomes essentially a floating sick ward. So fever moves through the cramped decks again and again. You got malaria, dysentery, tuberculosis, names that sound clinical now, but then meant sheer terror and weakness and just really often a death sentence. So 5 men had already died in Batavia, and that, grim as it was, turned out to be only the beginning. So the heat, the stagnant air, the poor water, the exhaustion of nearly 3 years at sea, all of it combines to break bodies that had somehow survived storms, reefs, and foreign shores. And Banks himself falls ill repeatedly. So does Solander, men who had stood on beaches cataloging wonders, now lie groaning in hammocks, scarcely able to lift their heads. I mean, it's total shift in scene.
Yeah. I think it's amazing too how this is where the story just really turns, right?
Yeah.
Because it's no longer about heroic collecting or botanical triumph. Okay. It's about endurance, about who survives long enough to make it home.
Yeah, it's the final stretch, right, in a sprint. And the deaths really do come thick and fast. So on Christmas Day, 1770, the Endeavour finally leaves Batavia, which we heard before break. And there's really no celebration at the point. Banks wrote that there wasn't a man aboard who wasn't utterly sick of what he called the, quote, unwholesome air of this place. And Cook later actually reflected that they'd arrived healthy and left like a hospital ship, and that Dutch captains had told them they were lucky not to have lost half the crew. So all things considered, they came out much better than a lot of other people. But within weeks, the ship is back at sea and men begin to die almost daily. So on the 23rd of January, Marine Corporal John Truslove dies. The next night, Banks is writhing in pain in his cabin when Herman Sporing, so that's Banks' secretary, a skilled draftsman and one of the quiet engines behind the scientific work, he dies in agony. On the 25th, the sailmaker John Ravenhill follows him, a man Cook described as looking 80 years old who had somehow survived Batavia by being more or less drunk every day. And then on the 26th of January, Sidney Parkinson dies.
Wow. That's just, what's crazy is that more and more death. And the one that really hurts, doesn't it, John?
Yeah.
Right? Parkinson is the eyes of the voyage, the person who actually shows us what Banks and Solander saw.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, Parkinson's a hard one because he had recorded, the beauty everywhere they went, the plants,
Yeah.
people, the rituals, landscapes. I mean, he was the guy that had to pick up the pen for Buchanan when he died earlier on in the voyage. But now he's gone. Another body that slides into the sea. And then 2 days later, Charles Green, the astronomer, he dies after a long illness. Cook, ever the blunt professional, noted that Green had, quote, taken no care to repair his health. So
Mhm.
there's something brutally unsentimental about that statement. By the end of January and then into February, the roll call of death becomes just relentless. Carpenters, sailors, the one armed cook, men who had patched the ship on the reef, men who had endured lashes earlier in the voyage, all gone. And by February alone, a dozen more were dead. And
Wow.
Banks is one that recovers physically remarkably quickly, but he's not the same man. His journal, which, we've been over the course of these few episodes now, they're usually bursting with curiosity and wonder about plants and animals and all kinds of things. Now it's becoming just bleak and sparse. Page after page is recording death, burial, and silence. He's just watching his friends being committed to the deep one after another. And that's, that leaves a mark on a person. And so, of the 8 men Banks had brought with him when they sailed from England, only 3 are still alive. That's Solander, Briscoe, and Roberts. Everyone else, artists, assistants, servants, gone.
And yet somehow the specimens survive. That's the astonishing thing. Amid all the misery, the plants make it.
Yeah, at least those plants. I mean, not the ones they lost during the whole catastrophe in the reef. But yeah, I mean, but that's the crucial part, right? Because while men are dying, the boxes of seeds and dried specimens, drawings, notes, all of that stuff is still being protected. I mean, the future of British botany is being nursed through fever and death on this ship. And when the Endeavour finally reaches Cape Town on the 14th of March, 1771, nearly half the company has died. And the Cape offers a brief respite. So you got food, fresh air, solid ground. And Banks and Solander had both been dangerously ill crossing the Indian Ocean. And only 2 days before sailing again were they well enough to do just a little bit of botanizing. And I mean, what a place to botanize, South Africa with all of its astonishing diversity of plant life. We've done a couple of episodes talking about South Africa here and there. Yeah, Banks' collection there was modest, especially compared to Australia. I mean, he was just exhausted at this point. I mean, not only physically, but his spirit was way low. And even Solander felt frighteningly ill once more while they were there. And 3 more men died during their stay in Cape Town. And rumors, on top of it all, were circulating in the Cape that Britain and Spain were close to war over the Falkland Islands. And so, with that news, Cooks wastes no time. After a month of being in Cape Town, the Endeavour sails again, stopping briefly at St. Helena before turning for home. And so, on the 28th of April, the ship crosses a milestone very few voyages had ever achieved. And that was the fact that they had completed the circumnavigation of the globe.
Wow. I mean, and that's amazing. And that's a big moment, right?
Yeah, I mean, how many people say they can circumnavigate the globe? I mean, in the 1700s. But yeah, it is. I mean, but Banks notes it with extraordinary flatness. All he writes is, "This day we crossed our first meridian and completed the circumnavigation of the globe." No explanation, no triumph. Just you could just sense the exhaustion in those lines.
Geez, that's not to go to be one of the most understated world historical moments imaginable.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, you would have to imagine Banks would have been so much looking forward to that moment, but now in the midst of just everything he's been going through these last few months, it's it hardly hits him. I mean, at this point, uh, death has just become routine. And so when Lieutenant Zachary Hicks died of consumption in May, Banks didn't even record it. So 41 companions were already gone at this point.
Mm.
And then in early July came one last blow. Banks records that his beloved dog, Lady, who had slept beside him throughout the entire voyage, was found dead in his cabin. Apparently, he writes here that she had cried out in the night, then fallen silent, and even that small personal comfort was just taken from him. And so the Endeavour limps northward through the Atlantic, battered, thinned, really just haunted at this point with all this death that has been experienced. But she's coming home. And so is Joseph Banks, no longer this carefree young gentleman adventurer who had left England, but a man marked by death, responsibility, and achievement on a global scale. And when that battered ship finally appears on the horizon of England, the question becomes not just what Banks brings back, but how Britain will receive him.
Ooh.
Right?
Ooh. Dun dun dun. Right. And it's so right. So let's look at the next what's happening, because by the summer of 1771, even Joseph Banks, whose enthusiasm for collecting plants seemed genuinely exhaustible, was ready for one thing above all else: home. Right. After nearly 3 years at sea, after danger and disease and death, the Endeavour finally slips back into English waters. And on the 12th of July, 1771, she sails into the harbor at Deal, just down the coast from the Thames, right? 3 years, a circumnavigation of the globe. And Banks records it just as he did with the circumnavigation, right? With extraordinary understatement. On the 11th of July, he notes, almost without any emotion, seeing the Lizard, the southernmost point of England. And then the following day, a single curt line at 3 o'clock landed at Deal. That's it. Curtain down on one of the greatest voyages in human history.
It's just, yeah, it's just oddly understated, isn't it? I mean, after everything he's been through, all he writes is at 3 o'clock landed a deal. That's
Done.
it. That's the final
And
note.
it is. That's it. And yet emotionally, this was anything but simple. Banks had lost friends, a lot of them. Batavia alone had been catastrophic. And when he came home, he was haunted by the loss. Whatever triumph he felt, and there was plenty of triumph, was shadowed by grief. Still, England greeted him not with silence, but with adulation, right? The day after the returning, Banks rushed back to his house at 14 New Burlington Street in Mayfair, right? Straight there. Where else was he going to go? Meanwhile, the Endeavour was sailed round to the Thames, to Galleon's Reach, where workmen began unloading what most have looked like treasure from another world. Over 30,000 botanical specimens, 1,000 zoological ones, many never seen by Europeans ever before.
Yeah, I mean, that just must have been, I mean, that's a staggering number. And just, 30,000 plants.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And that's the point, right? Banks had increased the flora known to Europeans by something like 25%, a quarter more plants. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around it, right?
Yeah.
London certainly couldn't. The press went mad. This wasn't framed as Captain Cook's voyage. It was framed as Mr. Banks' voyage, right? Cook, if he was mentioned at all, tended to appear as Lieutenant Cook of the Royal Navy, who sailed around the globe with Messrs. Solander, Banks, etc., right?
Oof. Yeah, that must have stung for Cook.
I mean, you think so, but Banks, young, rich,
Screen actor.
handsome, impeccably connected, was irresistible to the newspapers. He was honored as a kind of scientific action hero. The London Evening Post breathlessly reported that Banks and Solander had visited 40 islands, discovered at a southern continent near the Spice Islands, and survived a voyage that had killed 70 men. Then there's the Public Advertiser, which declared that they had made more discoveries in astronomy and natural science than anyone in 50 years. And Banks ahead, right? Well, it swelled enormously.
Yeah, you can almost hear it inflating. Yeah.
I mean, across Europe, but botanists were swooning. Linnaeus himself, the great Linnaeus, was enthralled, right? He suggested that New South Wales should be called Banksia. He wrote to Banks in Latin, congratulating the immortal Banks, calling him not only the glory of England, but the whole world, and suggesting that botanists should erect a monument to him, more enduring than the pyramids of Egypt. And now remember, Banks was just 28 years old.
Jeez. That is a dangerous age to be told you're greater than the pyramids.
No kidding, right?
Jeez. That is not the kind of confidence you want to give someone like a Banks, because it's gonna go straight to his head. But Patrick, that it wasn't just Linnaeus that were singing his praises and giving him lots of confidence, because there was also the king of England. So George III had taken a very personal interest in the Endeavour from the beginning. Because remember, he even put 4,000 pounds of his own money into the expedition. So when Banks returns, the most eminent person eager to meet him was the monarch himself. And so on the 2nd of August, 1771, Banks is presented to the king at St. James's Palace. And, the papers don't really tell us much, only that Banks was, quote, received very graciously. But what's clear is that this wasn't just polite curiosity. Less than 2 weeks later, the king summons Banks and Solander again, this time to Richmond, which is the king's summer home, for a
Okay.
private conference about their discoveries.
So this plant, right? This is really plants as power, really, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the king examines drawings, handles specimens, listens to Banks and Solander intently. And for weeks, Banks and Solander were in and out of the royal residence, explaining what they had brought back and what it might mean in the big picture of things. I mean, fresh produce, new crops, new botanical knowledge. This wasn't curiosity. This was empire. And since returning, Solander had already been to Kew. He was planting specimens from the Voyage in the royal gardens, and newspapers were delighted in reporting that these exotic plants were thriving as well as in their natural soil.
Yeah.
And as for Banks, I mean, he was everywhere. So on the 25th of July, he was the guest of honor at the Royal Society's Dining Club. In November, he and Solander received honorary doctorates at Oxford. Banks donated Tahitian and New Zealand artifacts to museums and eventually gave 500 different kinds of seeds from the Voyage to the Chelsea Physic Garden.
Okay.
What else? Tahitian seeds were planted in gardens in Hammersmith. I mean, the living spoils of the Voyage were being rooted quite literally into British soil.
Wow. I mean, once again, right? And Cook, right? Where's Cook in all this?
Yeah, what happened to Cook? The guy
What
that
happened?
actually steered the whole boat and kept everybody alive.
Jeez.
Well, Cook is still very much the working class professional. He's not like a Banks. He's not handsomely connected like Banks is. But that also Banks does help him. He suggests to his friend Lord Sandwich at the Admiralty that Cook deserved a promotion. And Cook later wrote to thank Banks for that. They had their differences, but Banks could open doors that Cook simply couldn't. Now, that said, not everyone was celebrating Banks' return. So Harriet Blosset, remember her?
I do.
His sort of fiance. He didn't really propose, but people are expecting that this was someone he was going to propose to. Well, so she had spent 3 years waiting for him, right? Knitting waistcoats, planning a future life with him. And during all that time, Banks had sent no letters at all. Remember, I mean, he was scribbling furiously in his diary and doing all these other note-taking, but nothing was going to Harriet. Not from Rio, not from Batavia. And when he returned, he just dodges her entirely. And so over the next several months, he's meeting with her on occasion. He'll convince her and maybe even to himself that he's going to marry her, only to renege on that. And that goes back and forth for months. And as you can imagine, it's driving Harriet just crazy. I mean, emotionally, it's got to be exhausting.
Oh, I bet.
And after much agonizing and indecision, Banks finally decides that he just can't marry her, and he pays her 5,000 pounds to settle the matter and just close the issue. That's, when you're a rich guy.
I mean, a fortune and still not a great look, right?
No, his friends mutter that while he might be a gentleman in name, he wasn't exactly one in nature. I mean, it's not a good look. And this drama with Harriet actually would follow him for some time in the press. I mean, we know about the press today and the celebrity news and gossip. That stuff was very much existent and alive in late 1700s England. But there was actually another Endeavour survivor that also grabbed headlines, Patrick. Not a scientist or a sailor, but a goat. Remember the goat?
I do.
Remember the goat of goats that we talked about that made the voyage?
Goats.
Well, that goat had actually survived, and it was celebrated in the newspapers, given a pension, a silver collar, and even made an honorary member of the Royal Society.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, come on. This is the goat of goats. And so the goat went on to live out his days in comfort at Greenwich Hospital. I mean, Britain, it seemed, was just in the mood to reward everything associated with this voyage. And so by the end of 1771, Joseph Banks stood, really at the very center of British science
So
and
funny.
society and just imperial ambition. I mean, he was the face of this emerging powerhouse that was the British Empire. I mean, he was famous, he was honored, fabulously influential, and he had changed what Europeans knew about the natural world and what they had thought, and actually what they thought they could do with it. But for Banks, this just wasn't the ending. It was barely even a pause, because once the applause died down, once the plants were unpacked and planted, and once the king had heard the stories, Banks began to ask a new question. And that was, what if they did it again? And next time, what if it were even bigger? So that's where we're going to leave this episode today. A lot more left in the Banks story. And he is, as you can see, far from ending his ambitions. And if anything, he is feeling more powerful, more energetic than ever. So we will have to see, Patrick, what happens next. On the next episode, of course, if you are a member of the History of Fresh Produce Club, you can dive right into that right now and find out where Banks treads next in his journey of life. Otherwise, you can wait till next week, at which point we will have you join us and see what happens next.
We got more.
The story of Joseph Banks. So until next time, it's goodbye for me, John Papp.
And goodbye for me, Patrick Kelly.